Today we are going to learn to make a circle skirt. I am using the pattern New Look 6313. So if you would like to see how I make this skirt, please stay tuned. So the first thing I want to talk about is the pattern. I don't actually cut out my pattern from the tissue paper. I trace around it with something called trace and toile, which you can get from like Spotlight or anywhere that sells fabric really. But basically it's this really thin see-through kind of fabric stuff. So it's a little bit more flexible than paper. And this is what I cut all my patterns out of in case I ever lose a piece, or if I go up or down in a size, I don't want to have to buy a new one. So this will keep all the sizes intact. And then I just stick all the pieces in a Ziploc bag, write the pattern, name, number, and size. And I've got a, a filing cabinet that I keep all of these in. So by putting them in here, all the different sizes are together, and then they all store in that for me. So this pattern only has 3 pieces to make the skirt. So you will obviously have your circle skirt. Obviously mine's not a half a circle because you put it on the fold. And then your front and your back waistbands. So I always lay my fabric in half with the fold away from me to cut this. If your fabric is directional, I don't actually recommend doing a circle skirt. You'd be better off with a box pleat skirt. So I want to put that edge along there. So this is the fold edge, and then that goes up over like so. Now there's a couple of ways. You can pin this, or you can put weights. I use weights. And my weights are literally really, really large nuts from Bunnings. So they're big enough to weigh down. They cost like, I don't know, maybe 60 cents each. So they're not expensive. They hold the pattern down so I can cut around them. I did that backwards. You should always start from the fold and then work away from it. These are just the biggest nuts that they sell at Bunnings. They have like a whole aisle, and you can just go grab as many as you want. As you can see, I've got quite a few because it just helps. So yeah, now I'm just going to cut around that, and it shouldn't move because we've put our weights there. There's no right or wrong way to cut this. You can start from wherever. I always start from the fold because it's easier to go away from it. But you could start anywhere that suits you. I also find these a bit quicker than pins. But if this was a rayon fabric, I would pin it because it would move too much. This being a type of suiting, it's a little bit firmer, so it's not going to move. So now we've got half a circle. Move the fabric up and do the same thing again. If you've got a large print like this, and as you can see, I've got slightly more fabric that I'm going to need, so I can actually decide where I want to put this, because that might matter to you. Keeping in mind that this is your waist and all of that is the bottom though. You notice I don't put any weights along here because we're not cutting there. If these were separate pieces, I'd put them all the way around. The scissors I'm using today are Fiskars, and they've actually got this spring loaded. So if you do a lot of sewing and a lot of cutting, they don't hurt your hand as much. Well, actually at all. My hand doesn't hurt at all when I use these scissors. They do take a little bit of getting used to if you're used to using normal scissors, but in my opinion, it's definitely worth the transition. I love these. I'm not going to throw this piece out because I'm going to see if I can get any of my waistbands out of it. I'm just going to come around here and cut back towards my other cut. If you don't have a large table, feel free to do this on the floor. More often than not, I will do this on the floor. So that's 2 of those. Then we've got our front and our back waistbands. Now again, these need to be on the fold, which is what the pattern says. So I'm just going to see if I can get them out of this. And I think I can. Get at least one. It's just nice to use your scraps where possible. You can iron the tissue paper or trace and toile stuff, but you do have to iron it on a very low setting. Once it starts getting too hot, it will just melt to your iron. And I've even tried putting a piece of paper or fabric over it. You still just want a very low iron. It's very, very meltable. So I got one out of my scraps. That makes me feel a bit better. The more left over here, I could actually turn this into like a matching clutch or a crossbody bag, which is probably what I'll end up doing. So again, you put the fold bit on the fold. If I haven't made this pattern a million times, I would probably pin this, just because it is a bit crinkled. But this is my absolute favorite. If I've got lots of fabric, this is the skirt that I make, if I'm not making a dress. Also, you can mix and match patterns. So this skirt piece is actually what I put on the bottom of all my circle skirts. Because they're the same, my waist is the same size. So from pattern to pattern, I just use the same thing. Why cut out 4 circle skirts in the different patterns when they're all going to be the same size? Alright, so this one doesn't have to be on the fold, because this is obviously where we put our zip in. But I just want to get it close to the edge, because I don't want to waste too much fabric. I didn't buy this fabric specifically for this circle skirt. It was just the last bit left on the roll. So I grabbed it and went, oh, I wonder what I can make. And then it sat there for ages because I've been busy with handbags. So I'm finally doing it. Alright, so because that was folded over, there's 2, but I actually need to cut 4 of this, because that's one side and the lining. So I'm just going to line this back up next to where it was, and go again. seem like much. I think I'm going to turn that into probably a Nora or a Lola from Swoon, because I think that would look amazing. Alright, now over to the sewing machine. Alright, so now that I've cut out all of my pattern pieces, I should have 2 long ones like this, 4 short ones, and 2 pieces of like main skirt. I'm also going to be using an invisible zip. This is a 12-inch invisible zip, which means if you're using an invisible zip, you'll also need an invisible zipper foot. And because I'm making all of this with no overlocker, I will also be using the roll hem foot to do the outside. Alright, so let's go. Oh, the needle I'm using is, for my industrial, I'm using a size 14. Because that was recommended as the smallest I go on this. If you're using a domestic machine, you should use, well, it depends on your fabric really, but usually you should use around an 80, size 80 needle. And my thread on this is actually green overlocking thread that I got from Spotlight. But again, if you're using a domestic machine, I highly recommend you use the Gutermann or Resant thread. Okay, so first thing we're going to do is join our large pieces together. So we're going to have one right side up and one right side down. Like this. And then we're just going to sew our normal seam allowance, which for this pattern I believe is 5/8 of an inch. So we're just going to... Now, if you are not confident, you should definitely pin this. I'm not going to, because I've made this skirt a million times over. Okay. I also need my iron for this too, so we're going to have to move again in a second. Alright, so now what you want to do is you want to take a pair of scissors and you're just going to trim back one side of the seam allowance. So you want to leave one side completely full and the other side you want to trim down so it's about half. So I'm just going to take my scissors and trim this relatively close to the stitch line. But again, so we're just doing one. So we're leaving one half there and we're cutting off the other one. If you've got an overlocker, feel free to just overlock this seam. But this is just for people that want to try it home without one. Also, if your machine's quite fancy, you might have an overlocking stitch as well. Feel free to use that. But I don't have a fancy machine. I've just got a straight stitch. So this is what you can do. I can't remember what kind of hem seam this is called. It does have a fancy name though. Alright, so I've trimmed down about half. So now we're going to go over to the iron. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the excess, so the larger side, and iron it up to my stitch line. So it's going to cover over the other side that we've just trimmed down. So we just want to go along slowly and iron that so it's rolled over in half. And then I'm just going to iron it over at the stitch line as well. So this is going to give us a really clean hem. There's going to be no raw edges, which makes it machine washable, which is something I personally love. So I'm just folding it at the stitch line because it's going to help hold it when we go and stitch it down. So now that that's ironed down, what we want to do is we want to come to the machine and I'm going to open it out and then lay it so I can see my hem. And then I'm just going to stitch about 1/8 of an inch away from the seam line. I'm going to make sure that I backstitch to lock my stitches in. And so what this is going to do is this is going to lock this seam. And by doing the double ironing, it's kind of just sitting where I need, so I don't need to pin it. If you've used a very lightweight fabric, you might still need to put some pins in it to hold it where you need to. Alright, so from this side, we now have, this is the seam, and then from the outside, we've just got a single stitch line down the skirt, which is barely noticeable, but it will hold it down. So do try and get that as straight as you can. Okay, so now we pop that aside and we're going to grab our waistband pieces. So one is an outside and one is an inside. So if you've got a pattern like mine, you might want to decide which one you want to be inside and outside. You also might not care. All right. So these have a center back and then you've got another side. So what you want to do is you want to take one set and we're going to stitch them right sides together to the waistbands like that. So I'm going to stitch here and here, and I'm going to do the same with this one. So I'm going to stitch, I'm going to place them down like this, and I'm going to stitch here and here using the seam allowance. And I can chain stitch these so I don't have to chop them all off. Again, feel free to pin that so that they don't slip on you. My fabric's not terribly slippery, so I'm not worried about that. So now you'll have two waistbands like this. They should be exactly the same. So what you're going to do is you're going to put one up, or right sides up, sorry, and one right side down, and we're just going to sandwich them like this. And then we're going to just stitch along the top, so the shorter side. So the bottom piece here will attach to the skirt, and this top piece we're going to stitch together so that there's not going to be any raw edges on our skirt. So you want to do a couple of back stitches at the front, and then so you can pin this if you want to, but if you're like me and you're not going to pin it, and you know that, what you want to do is you want to come to where the join is, and you want to make sure that that's even. Alright, and then I'm going to get to there, and I'm going to reline up again. So I'm just going to do mine in sections. So to there, make sure that I stop with the needle in the down position, and then come and line up my seam allowance again. Again, if I was making this in like a rayon or something, I wouldn't do it like this because rayon's far too slippery, so I would actually use quite a lot of pins. But something like sateen, which is a lot heavier, wouldn't need necessarily pins if you are, you know, average or above average sewer. So now this is what we should have. So now we're going to attach this to our skirt. So this I am going to pin. This is a magnetic pin board. Hold on. Oh, goodness me. This is a magnetic pin board I got for $3 from Spotlight. They are awesome. The pins don't come off. The rattling there is, I don't know. something. All right, so I'm going to start at one edge. So I want this to sit on like that with the other one at the top. So I'm going to put my right sides together and put a pin across like that. Most machines will run over pins if you do it like this, but it ultimately depends on your pins and your machine. Mine will, so I'll be able to keep these pins in as I sew. But because it's a circle thing, I am going to pin all the way along this. For circles, I do actually use quite a lot of pins. Now, when you get to this seam here, you've already stitched it down one way. Oh, hold on, you probably can't see that. Right, so I've stitched that down that way. So I need to make sure that this seam is going to be stitched down the same way. So I'm just going to pin that seam through the excess in the direction that I want it to be. Otherwise, you'll get a twist in your waistband and it won't sit as smooth and it'll drive you insane. Been there, done that. Unpicked it because it annoyed me so much. So the pins are probably, this is probably the longest part, or maybe the final hem. It could go either way. So I'm halfway now because I'm at my beautiful sewn seam there. Oh, I think I'm getting a cold. Or hay fever. Actually, I haven't had my hay fever tablet today. So I'm only putting like one pin approximately every inch. If you've got a stretchy fabric, you've got to make sure you're not pulling one more than the other while doing this. So a good way to do that would be to pin your ends, pin your center, and then work everything else in between to make sure that you're not stretching either the waistband or the skirt. Because then it'll sit funny and then you'll have this excess bit of fabric at the end, which is obviously not what we want. May seem like I've just done a lot of pinning, and I kind of have, but curves are tricky at the best of times, and I don't want mine to be crooked. Right, so I've done what I just told you guys not to do. I've got a little bit extra. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to work it back into the skirt. It shouldn't be too hard. Just might need some more pins. There we go. So, what looked like an issue is no longer an issue. I had just pulled towards the end. So I'm going to do it with the waistband side up to make sure that I'm not going to get anything attached in there. And then we're just going to use our 5/8 seam allowance to stitch that on. Making sure that we backstitch at the start. And if you're worried about your machine going over the pins, feel free to pull them out as you go. As you can see, mine doesn't have an issue with it. You also need to make sure that your circle skirt's not sneaking up underneath you as well. Alright, take your pins out. So now we've just got one cool solid piece. Where's my, there we go. Alright, so now I'm going to get my zip and just mark where it's going to go to. So you want to start the zip where the teeth start at that seam that we just did. If you're going to put a hook and eye, you want to start the zipper at the, like the edge of the zipper at the seam, and that gives you the room for the hook and eye. If you're not doing a hook and eye, you want to line this up so that the start of the teeth are at the seam we just made, and you just want to measure where your zip's going to go to. So mine's going to go to, so mine finishes here. Oh no, you can't see that. Mine finishes here, so I'm just going to mark half an inch up from the end of the zip to make sure that it's not going to poke out. So now that I've got that mark, I'm going to take these and line them all up. Like this. So what I did was I made sure that the top seam and the next seam line up perfectly, because you should have sewed the same seam allowance. If they're not even, just come back and cut one in or out, unpick it or stitch it in further to make sure that they are even, because you will notice that, especially with an invisible zip. So then I'm just going to line all of my skirt up like this. Oops. Make sure it's lined up all the way, and then I'm going to pin both sides into that pin that I've just done. And so now you want to sew the bottom part of the skirt shut. So you want to start at the pin with your seam allowance. Make sure that you backstitch. Make sure that your bottom is lined up. And then sew it shut. So now we're going to do the same thing that we did with our other seam. Now, if you've got an overlocker, before you do this, just overlock both sides, and that'll make it all happy for you. So I'm just going to snip at the line where we just sewed, and then trim off one side. It doesn't have to be perfectly straight, because we're going to hide this side anyway. I just want to make sure I don't cut the other side, otherwise I can't encase my seam, which would be a bother. And by cutting this fabric out, it also helps the seam be less bulky. Alright, so I'm just going to hit pause on the video, and I'm going to go and iron that over to hide the seam. So I'm going to iron it twice so that the seam's right along there, and I'll be right back. Alright, that's now sewn, so, not sewn, that's now ironed. So now I'm going to sew it. If you're wondering how that sits there, there's blue tack on the bottom too, by the way. It's not magic. So again, back stitch at the start, make sure it's all tucked under, and then stitch it down. Mine's not tucking under, so I'm just fiddling with it to make sure I'm going to catch it under the sewing. Because if you don't catch the edge, there's no point in doing it. going to switch my foot out to a roll hem foot. Now, if you don't have a roll hem foot, but you have an overlocker, you just overlock all the edge of the circle, and then you'll fold it up and stitch it down. But again, we're doing a tutorial without an overlocker, so. I always put the zip in last. It's like a habit I have because everybody hates hemming usually, and they always avoid it and they never get to it. So by putting the zip in last, I make sure I do it. But you could put the zip in and then hem at the end if you wanted to. That is entirely up to you. So I'm going to start at a seam. And then to start off the roll hem, you actually manually roll hem. So you fold it over and over again to give it a kick start, and then stick that under your foot. I'm going to make my stitch length 3, just a little, oops, come on, threaded. I just want to make it a little bit longer, but not so long that it's not going to hold. So it's not like a handbag when I do like a 3 3/4. I'm just going to a 3. So it's going to be a little bit longer, but not crazy long. So now that I've started it, you can hold the fabric up to help it go into the roll hem foot. So then, if you go nice and slowly, it should just feed its own everything in naturally. So we're getting a really fine hem. I'll do a little bit more and then bring it closer to the camera for you. So with my backhand, I'm just holding it so it sits up. And that way it's going to feed into the roll hem really nicely. You don't want to go 100 miles an hour on a circle because it can very easily have a meltdown, which is obviously not what we're looking for. Alright. So you've got like a really fine hem and the stitches are along there. If you don't have a roll hem, that's fine. You can manually do it. Again, or you can overlock and turn it up. I always find roll hems easiest on a circle skirt though. Not sure why, just do. So when we get to our next seam, that'll be halfway. That's a good way to tell. Notice I'm not going 100 miles an hour. I haven't got my foot flat to the floor because I don't want to... Oh, I just ran out of bobbin thread, which sucked. Should have anticipated that. I knew it was going to run out. Not to worry. Okay. So I'm just going to go over a few of the previous stitches to help it get it back in there. And I will come back and trim off the threads later. Alright, so I'm nearly to the halfway point. Now the seam might be a bit bulky, so sometimes you have to pull it from the back to help it through. Yeah. My roll hem foot's quite small. You can get different thicknesses. Mine is very small, so it sometimes needs a hand to get over the bulkier seams. never do this at 100 miles an hour. I would do it a lot faster if it was a straight edge, but because it's a giant circle, it does take a bit longer. But I think it's worth it. I think it's going to look lovely. So here's the end. We're nearly there. So when you get really close to the end, you actually have to manually tuck it and then lift up your foot and it will take it out of the fold so that you can get back to the start neatly. Alright. That is now hemmed and beautiful, so now we're just up to our zip. So before I do the zip, what I'm going to do, I'm going to roll hem this edge because we're not overlocking it, because I don't want it to be raw. This fabric frays quite quickly, so it's already started fraying. So I am going to start from the top seam, not the actual top, because that's all going to get tucked under. So I just want to start from there, and I'm just going to tuck it under. So the other option for it, actually, is you don't even need this foot. If you can be bothered, you can actually manually go along and tuck it and stitch it. So I'm currently not using the roll hem part of this foot. I'm actually just manually tucking it under and stitching it down to ensure that I've got no raw edges. So what I'll do is I'll take this foot off to show you that it can be done. Just put the normal foot back on. Alright. So I'm just going to fold it over again, pop it under the foot, back stitch obviously, and then stitch it down. You just roll hem it as you go. And what that's going to do is get rid of all our raw edges, so when we put our zip in, it's not going to fray and carry on. There you go. So that's now covered all our raw edges except the top edge, but we're going to deal with that. That's just last. So, if you're using an invisible zipper, you will need an invisible zipper foot. You can get them for both domestic and industrial. I think I got mine for $4 on eBay. If you've got a domestic, Spotlight sell them in a few brands. Most sewing machine shops will either sell them or can get them in for you. So this is what my one looks like. It's got like a channel. It looks quite funny actually. But that is the invisible zipper foot for an industrial. The domestic ones are just flatter because you don't have as much foot. So the first thing I want to do is make sure that my thread is going into the zipper foot and then out the back so that it stays out of the way. Now where's my zipper gone? Did I knock it on the floor? Oh no, I dropped my zip. Oh no, there it is. Okay, so the best way to remember how zippers go in is this. Lay your dress right side up, sit the zipper how you want it to sit, and then the closest side has to touch the closest side, so you flip it up and over onto itself, and that's where you're going to want it to go. So now that I've done that, I need to unzip it. And then I'm not putting my hook and loop at the top. So I'm going to line my teeth right up so that this part of the tooth where it's got like the plastic is going to line right up with that top seam. And then I never start right on the zip, like on the top. I start a little bit down and I'm gonna back stitch up to it because that plastic thing can get in the way. And sometimes my foot doesn't want to go over it. Okay, so I'm gonna hold the edge of the zip on the edge of the fabric and then just use my zipper foot and it should just stitch the zip down properly and lovely all the way down to our little split. And then just pull it out. And then you need to make sure that you haven't stitched any teeth, so zip it up to make sure it's going to go up. So that's one side in. So then we're going to do the same to the other side. So we're going to zip it up, hold the fabric so there's no twists or anything. You just want it to come straight up like this. And then we're going to unzip it and twist it up and over. And then stitch it down. Because this zip, this particular zipper foot does both sides, I can start from the top both times. That's not threaded, I could hear it. I mean, it was threaded, it just wasn't stitching. Back stitch, line the zip up with the edge. You also want to make sure that your skirt is not coming under this because you don't want to catch it. And I'm just going to do little bits at a time. Back stitch at the end, and then again we want to make sure that we can zip that up. Oh, I just twisted my zip, hold on. You also want to get rid of any excess threads because if they get stuck in the zip, they're not going to zip up. Alright, zip in. So now I'm just going to unzip it again. And this is the final step. So we're going to fold our top half of our waistband down. And then stitch it. So what you want to do is you want to fold it at that seam, which to here would look like the top seam. And then we're going to fold this bottom and tuck it. So you tuck the raw edges up into it. And I've started at the seam because I want it to be straight. So what we've got is we've got the seam there, and then I've tucked it up and under. So all of these raw edges will be folded like that and then pinned down. So you want to go ahead and do that all the way across the edge. Keeping in mind that it's not a straight piece, it's actually a curve. But you want to make sure that that top edge is nice, and then we just tuck the rest up and under. I'm going to pause this because this usually takes a little while because it's a curve. So I'll be back once I've pinned it all down. Okay, so when we get to the edge, so I've done 3/4 of the skirt, but when we get to the edge, what we want to do is we want to fold the zipper back. So it's going to sit flat like that. Then we fold the little extra bit of zip across because you want that tucked inside all of this. And then we fold it down from the seam, tuck it in. I'm going to put a pin there. I will actually hand stitch that little bit to make sure it doesn't pop out. And then I'm going to tuck the bottom up to the seam like that. I also forgot to mention, you want to put your pins so that the heads are facing towards the bottom of the skirt and the sharp pointy bits are facing towards the top. What that's going to do is it's going to hold it in there better for you. So I've just got a couple more pins to go. Now you've got a couple of options here. You can hand stitch this whole thing shut, which I will not be doing. But you can if you want to, and that way it's basically an invisible seam that you won't see from the other side. Or you can stitch in the ditch, which is, stitch in the ditch means to stitch in the exact place that you sewed last time. Or you can stitch like 1/8 of an inch up from the seam. So stitch in the ditch would be to stitch right along where we've joined it, or you can stitch like a little bit up. That is entirely up to you which way you want to do it. I'm going to stitch in the ditch because I can. It does take a little bit longer because you have to go slower, but I think it's worth it because then you don't see the stitches from the outside. And by stitching this up the way we are, it makes it machine washable without it all fraying and carrying on. So that's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to start, obviously from the outside so that we can see. And I'm going to start just off the zip. You don't want to stitch the zip because if you stitch the zip, it won't work. So we're going to do just a couple of stitches. And then back stitch. Like that. And then I want to hold it so that I know that the fabric's not going to catch. You just want to go nice and slowly. And try and stitch in that ditch. Or in the seam line. And again, it does take a little bit longer because you're being super precise, but it will look lovely at the end. Right, so right there I can tell that I pushed my pin in too far and the head got in the way, so I just took it out. You can take them out as you go if you want to. and then back stitch. Take all your pins out. You're also checking to make sure it did catch the other side. When I first made this skirt, when I was first learning to sew, I'd sometimes miss. So all you do is you reposition the fabric, pin it, and you're going to go back to the top side and stitch it down again. Now you could leave it there like that, but I think you'll find that you'll have to do a lot of tucking for the zip here. So that could technically fall out because we haven't stitched there. If you top stitch, it kind of defeats the purpose of having the invisible zip. So you can just hand stitch it. So I just grab some of this, and I'm just going to do basically a whip stitch, I think, just to sew the hole shut and so it can't pop out all the time. I have skipped this step before when I'm in a hurry and I want to wear it, and I regret it every time. So we're not going to do that. So all we want to do is we're just going to stitch along here, but not actually at the zip, because we don't want to stitch the zip shut. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come just this side of the zip and then go through like this. So go into the zip, but not near the zipper teeth. And just stitch it up like that. So it shouldn't take a whole, you don't need like a million stitches. Doesn't need to take you an hour to stitch it shut. You just want to make sure that they won't all pop out later. Just stitch it down. And then to tie it off, I go into the fabric like this, and then I wind it around 5 times. And then I use my finger to hold the knot at the bottom and then pull. Then we just got the other side. So again, we're going to put a knot. I'm also only doing single thread. You could do a double if you wanted to, if you're worried it was going to come undone. That knot fell off the edge. All right. So we're going to go in. Oops, the knot's not big enough. Apparently I can't tie knots today. Who knew? Alright, that ought to hold. So we go into the fabric, pull it out, and then you want to go into part of the zipper tape and then back out through the fabric. But you don't want to go, you don't want to do it right at the zipper teeth. Also, zipper tape is quite tricky to stitch through. It is quite strong. So I would advise, if you've got one, to use a thimble. I don't have a thimble, so I will quite often push it onto the table. So I'll go like this to help stab it through. Just push it onto the table. If you're not using an invisible zip and you're using a dress zip, you would actually catch this when you sew all the zip in. So you wouldn't need to hand stitch this. Okay, so that's stitched down. Now just tie it off. So we stab it through. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then tie it off. Oh, I'll go pop it on for you. Okay, so there is the skirt. I love it. It's got so many colours. I could style it with black, I could style it with blue, and it swishes around. There you go. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and I will do another one soon.